November 14th. Final date. That's what the paper said. Not eviction. Not foreclosure. Just final date printed in plain type like a dentist appointment, like something manageable. The bank car was already at the end of the street. Margaret Calloway, 58 years old, stood in the yard of the house she'd lived in for 22 years and felt the November cold move through her coat like it had given up trying to stay outside. Down the block, a car door opened. Someone stepped out with a camera. They didn't come to the door. They didn't need to. They just stood at the curb and took photographs of the property, quietly, professionally, the way people take things without ever raising their voice. Marge didn't cry. Didn't go inside. Didn't try to explain anything to anyone. She reached into her pocket. Thomas's key ring. His, not hers. 12 keys he had carried for 31 years. She had tried once to figure out what they all opened. She hadn't been able to. He'd been gone 3 years now, and she still hadn't moved them from her coat pocket. And she couldn't have told you why, except that when she held them, her hand didn't feel empty. She put them back in her pocket. On the passenger seat of her car, a printout. One photograph. A steel door rusted shut, set into a Kentucky hillside. 3 words beneath it. Starting bid, $400. She had exactly $400. She didn't know why Thomas had kept keys to things that no longer existed. She only knew that somewhere in those hills a door had been waiting, and that she was for the first time in a long time pointed in a direction. That was enough to start. The keys were Thomas's. That was the first thing she thought standing in front of the house on the last morning she was allowed to be there. Not my house. Not 31 years. Just the keys are Thomas's and I'm still carrying them and I don't know what that means anymore. November. The oak tree in the front yard had dropped most of its leaves overnight, brown and wet against the grass, against the porch. Steps, a few of them plastered to the lower shingles of the roof, the way things stick when they have nowhere else to go. The foreclosure notice was tucked under her elbow. Final date. November 14th. Today was the 12th. She had 2 more days to stand here like this, in her own yard, in front of her own door, and she was already running out of things to look at that didn't hurt. The bank car came at 8:14 in the morning. It didn't pull up to the house. It stopped at the end of the block, a gray sedan engine idling, and a man got out with a camera and a clipboard and didn't look at her once. He just stood at the curb and photographed the property, the front of the house, the driveway, the oak tree, quietly, professionally, the way people take inventory of things that are about to belong to someone else. Marge watched him. She didn't go inside, didn't call out, didn't cross her arms or raise her voice or do any of the things you imagine yourself doing in a moment like this when you're lying awake at 2 in the morning, trying to prepare for it. She just stood in the yard with Thomas's keys in her hand and watched a stranger photograph her life from a safe distance. The stair railing. That's what she kept coming back to. Thomas had installed it in 2003 because she kept catching her foot on the top step in the dark. He hadn't told her he was going to do it. She'd come home from work one Thursday, and it was just there, painted white solid as anything. You kept tripping, he'd said, like that was the whole explanation. Like noticing the thing she needed before she asked for it was just something he did. There was a paint smear on the kitchen wall, too. Blue. She'd tried to repaint the kitchen the winter after he died, bought the supplies, taped the trim, got through one wall and the upper half of a second before she'd sat down on the floor and not gotten up again. The blue was still there. She'd looked at it every morning for 2 years and told herself she'd finish it soon. She wouldn't be finishing it now. The man with the camera got back in his car and drove away without ever looking at her directly. Just like that. Just drove away. As if the whole thing had been administrative, as if she hadn't been standing right there. Marge looked down at the keys in her hand. 12 of them on the ring. She had tried after Thomas died to match each one to a lock. She'd gotten 7. The other 5 she didn't know. A storage unit, maybe. A padlock somewhere. A door that had already been sold or demolished or forgotten. Thomas had kept keys to things that no longer existed, and she had never thought to ask him why, and now she never could. She put the keys in her pocket. Didn't leave them on the porch. Didn't set them on the railing he'd built. Just put them in her pocket the way she had every morning for 3 years, because when she held them, her hand didn't feel empty, and that was the only reason she needed. She didn't look back at the house. She walked to the car, got in, and sat for a moment, with her hands on the wheel, and the heat running, and the smell of November coming through the vents, wet leaves and cold air, and something underneath it that was just the smell of old upholstery, and too many miles, the smell of a car that had taken her everywhere, and might be the only thing left that was still entirely hers. On the passenger seat, a printout. She'd found it at 2 in the morning, sitting in a McDonald's parking lot with her laptop and a Wi-Fi signal that kept dropping. She'd been looking at rental listings she couldn't afford when the browser glitched and redirected her government surplus foreclosed properties, the kind of page that exists for people who are searching for something they can't name yet. One listing. A photograph. A steel door rusted into a red clay hillside somewhere in Harlan County. 22 acres, no interior photos, no description beyond a GPS coordinate, and 3 words, starting bid $400. She had exactly $400. She didn't know what was behind that door. She didn't know if the structure was standing or flooded or condemned. She didn't know anything except that it was land, and it was in the hills and no one else had bid on it, and she had 2 days before November 14th and nowhere else to go. She didn't know why Thomas had kept keys to things that no longer existed. She only knew that somewhere in those hills a door was waiting, and that she was for the first time in a long time pointed in a direction. That was enough to start. 31 years, and the thing Marge knew best about a small town was this: its secrets didn't live in gossip. They lived in the books people checked out alone on Tuesday afternoons when the library was quiet. She had learned to read a town the way other people read weather, by paying attention to small things that most people didn't think anyone was watching. Who checked out family law books in the spring? Who checked out oncology texts in November alone, always in the last hour before closing? Who came in every week for 6 months in 2008 and sat at the corner table with books on personal bankruptcy and always left before the other regulars arrived? She never asked. That wasn't the job. The job was to find the right book for the right person at the right moment, and sometimes, if you were paying close enough attention, you could do that before they knew they needed it. It wasn't the kind of library that made the news, but it was exactly the kind of library that people needed, and Marge had spent 31 years making sure they could find what they came for. The closure notice came by email on a Friday afternoon. August 12th. 4:47 p.m. Subject line: Harlan County Public Library System Staffing Update. Budget cut 40%. The Harlan branch would close September 30th. All staff were thanked for their service. 31 years. One email. No one organized a farewell party. Everyone assumed someone else would. She had met Thomas Calloway at a library, actually a university library in Lexington. 1989, when she was 24 and he was 26, and they had both reached for the same atlas at the same moment, and he had laughed and she had not, and somehow that had been the beginning of everything. Thomas Calloway, civil engineer. The kind of man who fixed things before you noticed they were broken and never mentioned it afterward. He had installed the stair railing because she kept catching her foot on the top step in the dark. He had learned somewhere in the middle of their marriage exactly how she took her coffee, 2 sugars, a pour of milk, never cream, and made it that way every morning for 15 years without her ever having to say it again. She loved him the way people love something that has become air. You don't notice air. You don't think about it or appreciate it or take a moment to be grateful for it. You just breathe. And then one day it changes or thins or disappears entirely, and you understand for the first time what you had. He died on a Wednesday in March. Stroke. 64 years old. The coffee was still hot on the kitchen table when the paramedics arrived. He was the keeper of keys to everything: the toolbox, the filing cabinet, the small fireproof safe under their bed, insurance documents he'd said deed to the house. "Let me handle it." She had let him because he always handled things before she needed to think about them. And after 31 years, that had become as natural as breathing. She had never opened the safe. In 31 years, she had never needed to. Thomas always handled things first. The night before the foreclosure, she sat in the Civic in a McDonald's parking lot with her laptop on her knees and the Wi-Fi dropping every 4 minutes and the heat running, because November in Kentucky is not a month you sit in a parked car without heat. She was not looking for jobs. She had submitted 23 applications in 4 months. Library systems, school positions, a records job at a hospital she was overqualified for, an administrative assistant role at an insurance company in Lexington because she was running out of places to try. No responses. Not one. 58 years old, small-town librarian, 31 years at one institution on paper that looked like someone who had never taken a risk. She knew what it looked like. She also knew what it actually was. Nobody was asking. She was not looking for rentals either. She had done that math. First month, last month, security deposit $1,800 minimum. She had $400. The government auction page appeared by accident. She'd been trying to find the USDA Housing Assistance Portal, and the browser sent her somewhere else entirely. Most of it was what she expected: condemned buildings, abandoned lots, properties that had been seized and forgotten. The kind of listings that existed at the bottom of every system. One listing was different. 22 acres, Harlan County. One photograph. A steel door, heavy and rusted, set into a red clay hillside. No interior images. No description beyond GPS coordinates, and a single line: former storage facility. As is. Starting bid $400. Auction closes 6:43 a.m. It was 11:02 p.m. A librarian doesn't believe in fairy tales. Marge knew that about herself, but she also knew this every important thing she'd ever found in 31 years: the right book, the right answer. The right moment had come when she stopped searching for something perfect and started paying attention to what was right in front of her. $400. Land. Somewhere to go that wasn't a parking lot. Not a miracle. Just one small door that hadn't closed yet. She placed the bid, watched the screen. No one came. The auction ticked down through midnight and into the early hours of November 13th, and at 11:47 p.m., with $400 gone and a deed to 22 acres she'd never seen, Marge Calloway sat in a McDonald's parking lot and realized she hadn't been this certain about anything in 3 years. Not hopeful, not brave, just pointed in a direction which was more than she'd had yesterday. The fog sat in the hollows the way it always did in November, like the county itself was trying to sleep in a little longer before facing the day. Marge had lived in eastern Kentucky long enough to know that the hills looked different in November than any other month. Not bare, exactly, the ridgelines still held their shape. The pines stayed green, but stripped down to something essential, the way a room looks when you've taken out all the furniture and can finally see how the walls are built. She had always liked November for that. The clarity of it. The GPS dropped signal 12 minutes after she left the county road. She pulled over, engine idling, and unfolded the photocopy map the auction office had given her, a single sheet reproduced so many times the edges had gone soft, and the contour lines bled into each other at the margins. Another librarian might have been frustrated. Marge wasn't. 31 years of archival work had taught her that faded documents weren't useless. They just required a different kind of reading. You looked for what was still clear. You inferred the rest from context. She found the turnoff where the map said it would be a gap in the tree line marked by a rusted mailbox, with no name on it, the post leaning at the angle of something that had given up trying to stand straight, but hadn't fallen yet. The road beyond it was 2 tire tracks through dead grass, just wide enough for the Civic if she kept to the center and didn't think too carefully about the drop-off on the left side. She kept to the center. She didn't think too carefully. The steel door was larger than the photograph had suggested. It sat at the base of a low hillside set directly into the red clay like it had grown there, framed by limestone outcroppings. On either side, the surface streaked with rust that had run down in long vertical lines and dried there the color of old blood against gray metal. Dead vines covered the lower third. The hinges were the size of her forearm. Whatever this place had been built for, it had been built to last. She tried the key. It went in but didn't turn. She tried again. Nothing. She stepped back and looked at the lock, not at the key, at the lock itself, the way she'd learned to look at problems. Start with what the problem is telling you, not with what you want it to do. The lock had shifted. She could see it, the keyhole sat a few degrees off. True, the whole mechanism tilted slightly right. Not rust. Settling. The hillside had been moving in millimeters for 50 years, and the door frame had moved with it, and the lock had moved with the frame. She adjusted her angle. 15 degrees, maybe less. Third try, resistance. Fourth try, a click deep inside the mechanism, solid and unhurried, the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to open and was finally ready. 4 tries, she said to no one in particular, her voice strange in the open air after the silence of the drive. I once recovered a library catalog that a computer virus deleted in 1998. 4 tries is nothing, she pushed. The door was heavier than it looked, and it moved on its hinges with the slow, deliberate resistance of something that hadn't moved in years. The sound it made was low and metallic, less a creak than a groan, the kind of sound old buildings make when they're remembering how to be used. Then it was open. The air that came out was dry. Not stale the way she'd expected, not the damp mold smell of a basement that had been sealed too long. Dry and still and faintly mineral, like the inside of a stone wall. Someone had designed the ventilation correctly. Someone had thought about this. She used her phone flashlight. The beam cut a narrow path through the dark. First room, a long space maybe 40 feet with a low ceiling and walls of poured concrete that had been painted white at some point and had gone the color of old paper. A wooden table scarred with use, 2 chairs pushed under it. Steel filing cabinets along one wall, 4 of them, the kind with combination locks. A utility shelf holding paint cans and folded tarps, and a first aid kit with a red cross that had faded to pink. And at the far end of the room, a blackboard. Not a whiteboard, a blackboard, the old kind mounted directly to the concrete. And on it, in chalk that had faded but not disappeared, Reading List, Fall, 1987. Below that, a list of titles. Charlotte's Web, Bridge to Terabithia. Number the stars. The Witch of Blackbird Pond. Marge stopped. She stood in the middle of the room with the flashlight pointed at the board and looked at the handwriting, the way the letters were formed. The consistent slant. The small pause at the end of each word before the next one began as if the writer were thinking one step ahead at all times. A teacher's handwriting. She knew it the way she knew everything important, not from training, but from 31 years of quiet attention. Teachers wrote like that. The deliberateness of it. The assumption that someone would be reading this and needed it to be clear. This wasn't a storage facility. Someone had been here. Not visiting, living here or close enough to it. Teaching here or thinking about teaching. Reading lists didn't appear on the walls of places people passed through. She stood there for a long moment, the flashlight on the board, the titles of children's books hanging in the dark. Charlotte's Web. Bridge to Terabithia. Number the Stars, a story about a girl who hides what matters most to keep it safe. She went back outside to get the rest of her things from the car. The morning had warmed slightly. The fog was lifting off the lower ridges, pulling back like a curtain being drawn slowly to one side. From here she could see the clearing properly, for the first time, a rough half-acre of flattened ground, in front of the hillside ringed by second-growth timber, the dirt road coming in from the south. Quiet. Private. The kind of place you'd choose if you wanted to be somewhere that didn't appear on anyone's map. She was reaching into the back seat when she saw the tire tracks. They were on the far side of the clearing, near where the road curved back into the tree line, two parallel lines pressed into the soft earth, the tread pattern wider than her own tires, the edges still clean and sharp. Not old, not from last week or last month. Recent. The ground was still soft from last night's rain. These tracks had been made this morning or close to it. She straightened up slowly. The tree line was 30 yards away. She looked at it the way you look at something when you're trying to decide whether to be concerned rationally, carefully telling yourself there was a reasonable explanation. Could be a hunter. Someone checking a deer stand before season. Could be someone who took a wrong turn on the Forest Service road. Could be nothing. The trees didn't move. The clearing was completely still. The kind of still that wasn't absence of sound so much as the suspension of it, like something had paused to listen. She took her bag from the back seat, walked back to the steel door, stepped inside. The interior bolt was on the left side of the doorframe. She had noticed it earlier, a heavy steel bar in a bracket, the kind of lock that was meant to be used from the inside. She hadn't touched it. Hadn't needed to. She needed to now. She lifted the bar and set it in the bracket. She had never used the interior bolt before. She used it now. The electrical panel had a laminated instruction sheet taped to the inside of the door. Someone had thought about the person who would come after them. Marge stood in the storage room and read it before she touched anything. The whole thing, top to bottom, the way she read everything completely in order without skipping ahead. The sheet was handwritten in blue ink, the letters even and deliberate, each step numbered and spaced so a person could follow along without losing their place. Marginal notes in smaller writing beside several of the steps. Step 3, wait 30 seconds after hearing the click, don't rush. Step 7, the gauge reads low, but this is normal, do not adjust. The handwriting was the same as the blackboard. She found the generator in the back corner, a diesel unit small, the same basic design as the backup generator the library had used during winter power outages. She had watched the maintenance crew run that one enough times to know the sequence. Primer, fuel valve, choke. She read the instruction sheet one more time, then pulled the starter cord. 7 times nothing. 8th time, the engine caught a rough, coughing start that smoothed into a low, steady vibration. she could feel in the soles of her feet. Overhead, fluorescent tubes flickered once, twice, 3 times, and then held. Pale yellow light filled the space slowly, the way light fills a room that has been dark for a long time and has forgotten what it's for. Marge stood in the middle of it and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "There," she said. The third filing cabinet was locked. She found the spare key in the center drawer of the desk, taped to the underside of the drawer with a strip of electrical tape that had dried and gone brittle with age. People with careful habits hid spare keys within arm's reach of the locks they belonged to. She had learned that in 31 years of watching people look for things they had mislaid. Inside hanging folders neatly labeled by year, 1971 through 2003. 32 years of student files, each one a manila folder with a name typed on the tab and papers inside. Attendance records, progress notes, the kind of documentation that schools required and teachers produced by the thousands over the course of a career. Marge pulled one at random. Not to find information, just to understand the person who had made it. The typed forms were what she expected. The red ink in the margins was not. Eleanor Voss had written notes on every student in a hand that was careful and considered, and nothing like the bureaucratic language of the forms themselves. Not grades, not behavior assessments. Observations, the kind that took patience and time and a particular quality of attention. Daniel struggles with fractions but can explain unprompted why the river bends the way it does at the old mill. Don't make the mistake of teaching him only what he's slow to learn. Maria reads below grade level by the county's measure. She has read every book in this classroom twice and remembers details from books she read 2 years ago. The county's measure is wrong. James sits by the window and watches the parking lot. I don't know yet what he's looking for. I'm going to keep watching until I do. Marge set the folder down carefully. She reached for another, and another. The notes were in all of them, 32 years of children observed and considered and written down, not because it was required, but because Eleanor Voss had apparently been incapable of looking at a child without wanting to understand them. At the bottom of the last drawer, a class photograph rubber-banded to a manila envelope. 1983 printed in white ink in the corner. 22 children, arranged in 3 rows the way school photographs always were. And Eleanor younger, her hair darker, standing to the left of the back row. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at a child in the front row, slightly apart from the others, the only one not smiling. The look on Eleanor's face was not concern exactly, and not pity. It was the focused, patient attention of someone who has decided that this particular person is worth understanding and is prepared to wait as long as it takes. Eleanor Voss, elementary school teacher, Harlan County, 1971 to 2003, died 2019. 32 years in one building watching children, never married, no record of family. And now this, a sealed facility in the hills, a steel door with a keypad, and 32 years of student files stored in a locked cabinet underground. The journal was in the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a stack of unused grade books still in their plastic wrap. Brown leather worn at the spine, not the wear of heavy use, but the wear of something opened and closed many times, many more times than it had been written in. Marge recognized that kind of wear. She had seen it on books that people kept by their beds for years without finishing books they came back to in the night and set down again. Eleanor had begun writing in 1998. Not every day, sometimes weeks or months between entries. The handwriting was the same as the blackboard and the instruction sheet, but looser here, less deliberate. The letters of someone writing for herself rather than for anyone who would need to follow along. She wrote about students not by full name, just first names, sometimes only initials. Small portraits, a paragraph each the same quality of attention as the file notes, but warmer, more personal. The difference between a report and a letter you never send. She wrote about the town, the way it had changed since she'd arrived in 1971. The businesses that had come and gone, the families she had watched move through the school for 2 generations. The writing had the fond, slightly melancholy tone of someone who has watched a place long enough to understand it, but not long enough to stop being surprised by it. And then, in an entry dated March 2001, Eleanor wrote about herself. I've seen enough marriages break apart to know that people don't hurt each other out of malice. They do it out of fear, fear of not being enough, fear of being left, fear that the other person will finally see what they've been hiding and decide to go. I chose solitude. Not because I had no choice, because solitude causes less damage. Marge read it twice. The second time she wasn't reading about Eleanor anymore. She sat with the journal open in her lap for a moment and looked at the pale yellow light on the concrete walls and did not think about Thomas specifically, except that she did. And it wasn't painful, exactly. Just the particular weight of recognizing something true in words, written by someone who had never known you existed. She kept reading. 3 pages later, a different entry, 2000. 3 the year Eleanor retired. I have started keeping things in the quiet room. Not because I think the world is ending. Because I have learned over a long time that the things you love can be taken from you quickly and without warning, and I am tired of being surprised by that. The quiet room is the one place where what I have put there will stay. That's all I need it to be. And then in the same entry, almost as an afterthought, if anyone finds this place after I'm gone, I hope they understand this wasn't greed. This was the only way I knew to say I was here. I cared. Even if no one knew. The second door was at the end of the lower hallway. Marge had noticed it when she'd come down to find the generator heavier than the other doors. The frame reinforced a keypad mounted at shoulder height, with a small screen that glowed red in the dimness. No keyhole, no physical lock, just the keypad and the red screen, and a single word. Locked. She stood in front of it now and placed her palm flat against the steel, cold, even with the generator running and the temperature in the upper level beginning to rise. Whatever was on the other side of this door, Eleanor had decided it needed to be kept behind something that couldn't be opened with a key that might be lost or copied. She needed a number. Marge took her hand off the door and stood back and thought about what she knew. Eleanor Voss had been a teacher for 32 years. She had kept files on every student, had written notes in the margins, had stored records underground, in a locked cabinet in a sealed facility. She had written a journal for 30 years that no one was meant to read. She had written instruction sheets for generators that might be used by someone she would never meet. She had thought at every stage of her life about what she was leaving behind and who might need it. A person like that didn't choose a code at random. A librarian doesn't break down doors. A librarian finds the key in what has already been written. She went back upstairs. Sat down in Eleanor's chair, the wood worn smooth where Eleanor's arms had rested for how many years. She couldn't guess the surface of the desk, faded to a pale gold in the shape of where the light had fallen across it every morning from the same direction for decades. She pulled the journal close, opened it to the first page. Not to understand Eleanor anymore. She understood Eleanor well enough now to find the number Eleanor had hidden in her own words without knowing she was leaving it behind. September 9th, 1971. Eleanor had written it 5 times across 20 years of journals, not with nostalgia, not with the soft, backward-looking sentiment of someone who wished they were younger. With gratitude. The precise, specific gratitude of someone who had been waiting a long time to become useful and had finally on that particular Tuesday morning in September understood what they were for. September 9th, 1971, the first day, 22 children who did not know me and had no reason to trust me. By the end of the hour, 3 of them had shown me something true about themselves without meaning to. I have been trying to deserve that ever since. Marge had been reading for 2 hours. She had gone through the journal the way she went through any document she needed to understand, not cover to cover in a straight line, but in passes first for tone, then for content, then for pattern. What repeated? What Eleanor returned to when she wasn't thinking about structure. What she wrote about in the same language year after year, without seeming to notice she was doing it. September 9th, 1971. 5 times in 20 years. The date of the first day of school. The day Eleanor had written in an entry from 2001 was, "The only day I have ever felt with complete certainty that I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing." 6 digits. Marge wrote them on the back of her hand, with the pen she'd found in Eleanor's desk drawer. 090971. She went downstairs. The keypad screen glowed red in the dimness of the lower hallway. Marge stood in front of it for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. She had learned in 31 years that the moment before you opened something unknown was worth taking seriously. Not with fear, with attention. She entered the first digit. 0. A soft beep. The screen held red. 9. 0. 9. 7. 1. For a moment, nothing. The red glow unchanged. Then a sound from inside the door, mechanical and sequential, the sound of multiple locks disengaging one after another in a deliberate order, like a combination being solved from the inside. The screen shifted, red to green. One word, open. She pushed. The door was heavier than the outer door. It moved on its hinges with the slow, pressurized resistance of something that had been sealed rather than just closed. The kind of door that was built to hold its contents against more than ordinary time. The air that came through was different from the rest of the facility, colder, drier, carefully controlled. Motion sensors. Lights began activating in sequence one section at a time from the doorway into the space beyond. Marge stepped inside. She saw the books first. Not because they were the most valuable thing in the room. She didn't know yet what the most valuable thing was. She saw them first because they were what she looked for in any space the way other people looked for windows or exits. Hundreds of them, leather-bound in brown and dark green, arranged on shelves that ran the length of the left wall from floor to ceiling. Not library shelves, custom-built, the wood dark and solid. Each shelf fitted with a small lip at the front to keep the contents from shifting. She crossed to the nearest shelf and took down a volume. It wasn't a book. It was a journal, the same brown leather as the one upstairs, the same even handwriting inside. But the name on the first page wasn't Eleanor's. It was a child's name. A first name, a last initial, and a year, Tommy R., 1974. She opened it. Tommy arrived in September already certain he was stupid. Someone had told him this, or he had concluded it himself, it doesn't matter which. What matters is that he believes it completely. My work this year is not to teach Tommy reading. It is to find the one thing he is certain he can do and show it to him before he decides the other thing is permanent. Marge set the journal down carefully. She looked at the shelves. Hundreds of volumes. She pulled another at random, Sarah K. 1989, and another Marcus D. 2001. Each one a child. Each one a year. Each one the same quality of attention, the same refusal to accept what the official record said about a person. 32 years of children. Every one of them written down. Not because anyone required it. Not because there was a system or a mandate or a curriculum that asked for it. Because Eleanor Voss had looked at a child and decided that what she saw was worth keeping. Eleanor had been seeing Tommy. For 32 years, she had been seeing children that no one else bothered to look at, and then she had locked the door and gone home alone. Marge stood in the silence of the vault for a long moment. Then she kept moving because there was more, and she needed to understand all of it. The right wall held glass cases, climate-controlled, each one displaying a temperature and humidity reading on a small digital panel. Coins in the first case, not ordinary coins, but specimens arranged in velvet trays with small printed labels. Gold, silver, foreign currencies with unfamiliar scripts. The labels were precise and detailed dates, mint marks, condition grades, estimated values. The second case held paper currency large format notes from the early 20th century, some of them ornate enough to look like invitations to something important. Certificates, bonds, documents with the weight of institutions behind them. The third case artwork. Small pieces, each one in a climate-controlled frame, with a certificate of authenticity sealed in plastic beside it. A harbor scene in oils, a small bronze figure, a watercolor of a coastline that caught the existing light and threw it back in a way that made Marge stop walking. And at the far end of the room, a central desk clear except for a leather-bound ledger and a white envelope sealed. The envelope had 4 words written on it in Eleanor's handwriting. For the woman who finds this. Marge sat down at the desk. She opened the ledger first, not because she was avoiding the letter, but because she had spent 31 years understanding that context mattered, that you read the document before you read the interpretation of the document. The ledger was meticulous. Columns for date, item, purchase price, current estimated value. The earliest entries dated from 1979, 8 years after Eleanor began teaching, 3 years after she had, according to her journal, finally paid off the last of what I owed and started keeping what I earned instead. The entries continued through 2018. 40 years of careful accumulation. Each purchase small by the standards of wealth, but consistent, considered chosen by someone who understood that value was not the same as price, and that the things which held their worth across decades were the things built on something real. The final page had a single line at the bottom underlined once total estimated value. As of final assessment, $4.2 million. Marge read it twice. She looked up at the room around her, the glass cases, the shelves of children's journals, the climate-controlled artwork, the ledger in her hands, and understood slowly that she was sitting in the life's work of a woman who had spent 40 years building something she never told anyone about. Not out of shame, not out of greed, not out of the same impulse that had made her write notes in the margins of student files and keep journals for children who would never read them, because she needed there to be somewhere that what she cared about would stay. She set the ledger down and picked up the envelope. The seal broke cleanly. One page inside, handwritten, the ink slightly faded at the edges where the paper had aged. If you're reading this, then you found your way here. That means something, not luck, not accident. It means you paid attention when it would have been easier not to. I spent my life paying attention to people that other people overlooked. I don't know who you are, but I know that whoever found their way to this room in this hill behind this particular door, they were looking for something. I hope what you find here is useful. The journals on the left wall are the most important thing in this room. More important than the money. More important than everything else combined. If you do nothing else, find a way to make sure the children in those journals know they were seen. The rest is yours. I hope it helps. Eleanor Voss. Marge sat for a long time. She didn't count the money, didn't go back through the cases, or add up the ledger entries, or try to calculate what $4.2 million might mean for a woman who had $400 in her account, and a deed to 22 acres, and nowhere to sleep tonight, except a bunker in a Kentucky hill. She just sat in Eleanor's chair, the one from upstairs that she'd brought down without deciding to. The way you carry things you've been holding, and looked at the letter and the ledger and the rows of children's journals, and thought about a woman who had spent 32 years seeing people clearly, and then come here to this room alone and written it all down. Because she needed there to be somewhere that what she cared about would stay. Marge understood that. She understood it the way you understand something that was always true about yourself, but that you needed someone else to say first. Before we go further, if you've stayed this long, you already know something important about this story. It isn't really about the money. It's about what people keep hidden and why and what happens when someone finally pays attention. Stay with us. The hardest part of Marge's story is still ahead, and it has nothing to do with the vault. She folded Eleanor's letter carefully and put it in her pocket. Outside, through 2 levels of concrete and steel and a hillside of Kentucky clay, it was still November. Still cold. The bank car had already been to her street and taken its photographs and gone. She had $4.2 million and nowhere to sleep. She had Eleanor's letter and 32 years of children who had been seen. And she had somewhere in the hills outside a set of tire tracks that were fresh this morning and belonged to someone who was not a hunter and had not taken a wrong turn. She hadn't forgotten about those. The knock came the next morning. No one knew she was here. She hadn't told anyone, hadn't filed any change of address, hadn't done anything that would put her name on a map. She had driven up a dirt road with a photocopy map and a key from an auction office, and hadn't spoken to another person since the woman at the county clerk's window 3 days ago who had handed her the deed, and said good luck in the tone of someone who didn't mean it badly, but didn't mean it hopefully either. She was upstairs making coffee on the small camp stove she'd found in the storage room when the knock came 3 times deliberate, the kind of knock that wasn't asking permission so much as announcing an arrival. She stood still for a moment. Then she went down. The man outside was in his early 50s, gray suit. The kind of shoes that cost more than Marge's monthly mortgage payment had been when she still had a mortgage payment. The shoes were caked with mud from the walk up the hill, red Kentucky clay that didn't belong on leather like that and wouldn't come off easily. He was smiling when she opened the door. Not a surprised smile, a prepared one, the kind assembled in advance for a specific occasion. Ms. Calloway, my name is Dennis Hargrove. I'm Eleanor Voss's nephew. A brief pause. I was hoping to collect a few family keepsakes if you don't mind. Sentimental items. Nothing of real value. 31 years reading faces across a library desk. She had learned in that time that people who were telling the complete truth didn't usually specify that what they wanted had no value. People who wanted something valuable specified otherwise preemptively before you could think to ask. Miss Eleanor lived here alone from 1971, Marge said. I've read her files. Not entirely true, she had read some of them, but she said it the way she'd learned to state partial information in a library context as a fact, complete enough to be useful, incomplete enough to leave room. Dennis's smile didn't disappear. It adjusted a small recalibration, the way a chess player shifts weight when a piece has been placed somewhere they hadn't anticipated but can work with. She didn't talk about family, he said. That doesn't mean family didn't exist. He wasn't surprised. That was the thing. He wasn't defensive, and he wasn't surprised, and he hadn't glanced past her into the space behind her the way people did when they were looking for something specific. He had looked directly at her the whole time with the calm attention of someone who had already done their research and was now conducting a confirmation. He knew she was here before he came. She didn't know how, but she knew. "I'll need some time to go through things before I can make any decisions about the property," Marge said. "I'm sure you understand." "Of course." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, cream-colored, embossed, the kind that cost money to print. "Take all the time you need. I'll be in the area." He had already been in the area, since at least yesterday morning. She took the card, said nothing else. He nodded once, the nod of someone concluding a meeting that had gone more or less as expected, and turned and walked back down the hill toward the tree line where she now knew a car had been parked since before she woke up. She watched him go. He stopped at the doorway, not outside at the threshold. One foot on the step, one still inside the frame, as if he hadn't quite decided to leave yet. He was looking at the blackboard on the far wall. The reading list: Charlotte's Web, Bridge to Terabithia, Number the Stars. The prepared expression was gone. What replaced it was something Marge recognized from 31 years of watching people in libraries. The look of someone encountering a thing they had not expected to feel anything about, and finding unexpectedly that they did. "She taught my father," he said. Not to her, not quite to the room. The words had the quality of something said aloud, because saying it silently wasn't enough anymore. He talked about her every year on the first day of school, said she was the only teacher who ever told him he was going to be all right when nobody else was saying that. A pause. I don't know if she remembered him. He left without looking back. Marge stood in the open doorway and watched the tree line close behind him, the branches moving once and then settling back as if he had never been there, and held the business card in her hand and thought about a father who had mentioned his fourth-grade teacher every year until he died, and a son who had driven to eastern Kentucky in an expensive suit with prepared words and mud on his shoes. He wasn't completely lying. That was the part that made everything harder. Ruth Chen arrived on the third day. She drove a truck that had seen better decades and knocked on the steel door with the brisk confidence of someone who had knocked on doors in this county for 71 years and had never once been turned away for long. She was carrying a jar of cider, the homemade kind, the label handwritten, and a manila folder. "I heard someone bought Eleanor's land," she said when Marge opened the door. "I figured I should come by before the other people did." "What other people?" Ruth looked at her the way experienced people look at questions that will answer themselves shortly. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you what I brought." They sat at Eleanor's table, the one upstairs, the worn wood, the chair Marge had been sleeping near, because she hadn't yet let herself sleep in it. Ruth set the cider between them and opened the manila folder without preamble. She had been Eleanor's neighbor for 40 years. Not a close friend, she was precise about this distinction, in the way of someone who had thought about it. Eleanor didn't have close friends. She had people she trusted with specific things. I was the person she trusted with the land records. In 2003, Eleanor had purchased an additional 12 acres adjoining the western edge of the property. Cash transaction, no mortgage, recorded quietly in a county filing that would have been easy to miss. "She never told me why," Ruth said. "I never asked." "Why not?" Ruth looked up from the folder. Her eyes were the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who had spent 35 years reading tax documents, the kind of eyes that sorted information into relevant and irrelevant without appearing to try. "Because I know the kind of person who doesn't want to be asked," she said. "I've been that person. It doesn't help when someone asks." A pause. "Though sometimes I wish I had. Just once." Marge looked at the folder, at the land records, at Eleanor's signature in the corner of the 2003 filing, the same even handwriting, the same deliberate pause at the end of each letter. "What do you know about Dennis Hargrove?" she asked. Ruth's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled the way a person looks when they've been waiting for a specific question and are relieved it's finally been asked. "I know he's been calling the county clerk's office since August," she said, "asking about the property status, asking who bought it." She turned a page in the folder. "I know his grandfather was a Hargrove from Bell County, and his father attended Harlan Elementary from 1965 to 1971. The last year Eleanor taught. The first year she had the facility built." "He has a connection," Marge said. "He has a story," Ruth said. "That's not the same thing." They worked through the afternoon, Ruth reviewing the property documents, Marge making notes, the jar of cider open between them. Ruth had the methodical efficiency of someone who understood paperwork the way Marge understood books, not as obstacles, but as languages, each one with its own grammar and its own way of hiding what mattered most in plain sight. At some point, the light through the upper vent shifted from afternoon to early evening, and Ruth reached the page in the mortgage documents where Thomas Calloway's name appeared, a co-signatory from the original purchase. Standard language, the kind of routine legal detail that appeared in dozens of places in a 30-year home ownership history. She mentioned it the way she mentioned everything, directly, without emphasis, one fact among many. "Calloway, your husband, right? I remember him." She turned the page without looking up. "Few years before he passed, he came to see me. Asked about personal bankruptcy procedure. Quite specific questions, not general interest, the kind you ask when you're trying to understand a particular situation." She made a note in the margin of the document. "I assumed it was professional curiosity. Engineers sometimes deal with contractor insolvency." She kept reading. Marge set her pen down on the table. She kept her eyes on the page in front of her, the same mortgage document, the same paragraph she had been reading when Ruth spoke the same words in the same order. She read them again. They didn't change. Thomas asked about personal bankruptcy. Specific questions, not professional curiosity. The safe under the bed, the key on the ring she still carried everywhere. "Let me handle it." She didn't say any of this. She picked her pen back up, made a mark on her notepad that meant nothing, looked like she was still working. Ruth kept reading. Marge kept her eyes on the page in front of her and understood slowly that there was a question she had been carrying for 3 years without knowing what it was called. The lawsuit was filed on Monday. Dennis hadn't waited. He had never been waiting, he had been ready. The documents arrived by email at 7:14 in the morning, forwarded from the county clerk's office to the address Marge had put on the auction paperwork, the only address that existed for her now, technically, since she no longer had a house. The subject line said, "Notice of legal action," in plain text. The way official things always announced themselves, without drama, without apology, as if the weight of what they contained was simply assumed. She read it twice at Eleanor's desk in the pale morning light coming through the upper vent. The argument was straightforward, which made it worse. Marge had purchased the land. The land was hers. But the assets inside the vault, the coins, the artwork, the ledger, the children's journals, all of it constituted uninherited estate property that had never passed through proper probate. As Eleanor's closest living blood relative, Dennis Hargrove had standing to claim them. The purchase of the property did not constitute purchase of the contents. It was a reasonable legal argument. She could see that. She could see it the way you could see from a certain angle how a road could look like it went straight when it was curving the whole time. She called the only law office in Harlan. The receptionist told her the consultation fee was $300 an hour. Her checking account held $47. Ruth offered to lend her money. Marge said no, not from pride, or not only from pride, but because a 58-year-old woman with no income and no address going into debt to fight an Atlanta law firm felt less like a strategy and more like a longer way of losing. Maybe Dennis was right. Maybe this had never been hers. She sat with that thought for a while. Let it settle. Tried to decide if it was true or only felt true because everything else had stopped feeling reliable. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. She drove back to Harlan on Wednesday, not because she had a plan, because the bank was coming Friday to complete the property transfer, and there were documents she needed, her own papers, the ones that proved she was a person who had existed somewhere before a government auction and a hillside in November. And because she needed to move, needed to do something with her hands. Sitting in the vault, thinking about Dennis's lawsuit, and Ruth's offhand remark about Thomas, and the question she couldn't name yet, that was more than she could hold still for, the house felt different. She had known it would. Houses always felt different after the decision had been made about them. They became spaces you were passing through, rather than living in the way a hotel room felt different from a bedroom, even when it contained the same furniture. She went through the kitchen first. The blue paint on the wall, she looked at it for a moment, and then looked away. Upstairs. The second bedroom, the filing cabinet, the box of documents she'd come for. She pulled it out from the closet shelf and set it on the bed, and opened it, and went through it methodically, the way she went through everything, in order without skipping. The deed to the house was in there. In Thomas's handwriting at the bottom, Thomas and Margaret Calloway, joint tenants. She put it in her bag. She was about to close the box when she remembered. The safe was exactly where it had always been, under the bed, pushed to the back, the gray metal visible if you knew to look. She had walked past it 1,000 times. Had reached under the bed for other things, a lost earring, once a library book that had slipped off the nightstand, and her hand had touched the corner of it, and she had thought nothing because there was nothing to think. It was just the safe. Thomas handled it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. The key ring was in her coat pocket. It was always in her coat pocket. She reached in and took it out, all 12 keys, the familiar weight, and found the smallest one. The one she had never used. The one she had never needed to use. Because Thomas always handled things first. She held the small key for a moment. Then she unlocked the safe. Not insurance documents. She saw that immediately the shape of the papers was wrong, too many of them folded differently than documents that were meant to be stored and forgotten. She lifted the stack out and unfolded the top sheet. Bank of Kentucky. Commercial loan agreement. Borrower Thomas E. Calloway. She turned to the next one. Mountain Capital LLC. Promissory note. And the next. And the next. Signed in Thomas's handwriting, the signature that leaned right always like someone who was already moving toward the next thing before the current thing was finished. 6 documents. Different lenders, different dates, the same borrower. She turned to the last page of the last document, where the totals were summarized in the clean, indifferent language of financial institutions. Total outstanding obligations as of December 31st. 340,000. She put the papers down on the bed. She picked them up again. She read the dates. The first loan was signed in March 2016. The last one, an extension, a renegotiation, the kind of document you signed when you had run out of other options, was dated November 2020. 4 months before Thomas died. The real estate project was listed in the third document, a development in Lexington, mixed use, the kind of investment that looked reasonable in 2016 and had gone bankrupt by 2019. Thomas had known in 2019 that the money was gone. He had known for 2 years that the house was going with it. He had known. And he had come home and made coffee and asked her how things were at the library, and said, "Let me handle it," and handled it alone in silence. In whatever way a person handles the knowledge that they have made an irreversible mistake and cannot find a way to say so. Let me handle it. This was what he had been handling. Marge sat down on the kitchen floor. Not on a chair on the floor, back against the refrigerator. The stack of papers in her lap in the kitchen, where the coffee was still warm on the morning. He died, and the blue paint was still unfinished on the wall. And 31 years of ordinary mornings had accumulated into something she had believed completely was solid. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. She sat and looked at Thomas's signature, the lean of it, the rightward tilt, the way it looked like a man always halfway out the door, and tried to understand something that didn't have a word in any language she knew. He loved her. She knew that without needing proof, without needing to think about it, the way she knew her own name or the layout of the library she'd worked in for 31 years. It was simply true, the way some things were true before you examined them and remained true after. And he had lied to her for 5 years because he was afraid. Not afraid of her. Afraid of what she would see if she looked at him clearly, a man who had made a serious mistake, who had been trying to fix it quietly and couldn't, who had decided that protecting her from the knowledge was the same as protecting her from the harm. The same fear Eleanor Voss had written about in a journal no one was supposed to read. The fear that if someone saw you clearly, they would leave. The fear that love was conditional on not being fully known. The exact same fear. 2 people, one a school teacher who had never married, one a civil engineer who had, and between them without ever meeting the same architecture of silence. The same locked doors. The same belief that keeping something hidden was a form of care. She sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. She drove back to the hill as the light was failing. She didn't go inside immediately. She sat in the car at the top of the dirt road and looked at the steel door and thought about Dennis Hargrove's business card in her jacket pocket and the phone in her hand and how simple it would be. One call. A number she already had. "Whatever you want. I'll sign tonight." Not because he deserved it. Because she was too tired to be the person who fought for the right thing. Because Thomas had been wrong, and Eleanor had kept every door locked her entire life, and she the woman who had made a profession out of paying attention to people who had believed that careful attention was its own form of love, had missed the most important thing happening in her own house for 5 years while she was paying attention to everyone else. What good was careful attention if it pointed in the wrong direction? She sat with the phone in her hand. She didn't make the call. Not from strength. From the particular stubbornness of someone who has been sitting on a kitchen floor and gotten back up, which was not the same as being strong, but was perhaps enough. She got out of the car. She walked to the steel door, and as she reached for the handle, a knock came from the other side 3 times, the same brisk confidence she had come to recognize. "It's Ruth," came the voice through the steel. "I brought soup, and I know a lawyer in Lexington who has owed me a favor since 1987. Carol Miyamoto's office was above a laundromat on Tanner Street, and her desk was covered in files organized by a system only she understood, but she read the documents in 12 minutes flat and asked exactly the right questions. Marge had driven to Lexington on a Thursday morning, 2 days after Ruth's soup and the name of a lawyer who owed a favor. The drive took 90 minutes. She spent most of it not thinking about Dennis's lawsuit, or the hearing date, or the $47 in her account, but about the specific texture of not knowing whether you were doing the right thing, that particular kind of uncertainty that wasn't doubt exactly, more like the feeling of walking on ice and not being able to tell from the sound whether it was thick enough to hold. Carol was 55, gray at the temples, wearing a blazer that had been navy once, and was now the color of something that had been washed many times and had stopped trying to be a specific color. She read without looking up, made notes in the margins of her own notepad in handwriting, too small to read from across the desk. Turned pages at a pace that suggested she was reading every word and not slowing down for any of them. At 12 minutes, she set the documents down. Eleanor Voss never left a will. Not that I found. Interesting. She turned back to her computer and typed something. Give me a few days. The hearing was on a Tuesday. Harlan County Courthouse. A room that smelled of old wood and radiator heat, the kind of room that had seen 100 years of people trying to establish what was theirs and what wasn't. Dennis arrived with 2 attorneys from Atlanta. The suits were correct for the room, expensive and conservative, the kind of clothes that communicated we have done this before without having to say it. Carol arrived in the navy blazer. She carried a manila folder and a second folder Marge hadn't seen before, held separately close to her body. Ruth and Deputy Sal sat in the back row. Ruth had brought her reading glasses and a notepad. Sal had his arms folded, and the expression of someone attending an event he didn't entirely understand, but had decided to take seriously. The judge was a woman in her 60s, Judge Patricia Holt, according to the nameplate, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had been in this room long enough that nothing in it surprised her. Dennis's lead attorney presented first. He was good. Marge could see that clearly, the way you could see someone was good at something, even when you hoped they weren't. The argument was methodical and specific. The property had been sold at auction as undeveloped land. The auction documents made no reference to contents. The assets inside the vault artwork, financial instruments. Personal property constituted uninherited estate property that had never passed through probate. Under Kentucky law, a blood relative had standing to claim estate assets that had been improperly excluded from settlement. He presented the DNA results. The family tree. A brief history of the Hargrove connection to Eleanor Voss, through her half-brother, Dennis's grandfather. The assets belong to the estate, he said. The estate belongs to the heir. The judge made a note. Looked at Carol. Ms. Miyamoto. Carol stood. She didn't have the other folder yet. She set down her notepad and looked at the judge with the calm expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment and found that it felt, as most waited for moments, did more ordinary than anticipated. Your Honor, I'd like to address a premise in Mr. Sutherland's argument. He states that Eleanor Voss's estate was improperly settled, that assets were excluded. I'd like to suggest that they weren't excluded. They were deliberately, legally, and specifically directed. She picked up the second folder. Eleanor Voss did not forget to write a will. She chose not to write a conventional will, because in 2015 she had already done something more specific. The document was 8 pages. Carol set it on the judge's table. Not quickly, not with drama, just set it down the way you set down something that was going to stay there. The judge picked it up. Read the first page. Turn to the second. The room was quiet, in the way rooms were quiet, when everyone in them had understood simultaneously that something significant had just changed. A living trust notarized on March 14, 2015. Filed with the Harlan County Recorder's Office 4 days later. Executed by a local attorney, Harold Briggs, now retired, who had confirmed its authenticity by phone 3 days ago when Carol had called him. The trust transferred all assets held at the property, known as Ridge Road, 14 Harlan County, Kentucky, to the future owner of said property, whoever that person may be at the time of my death, having purchased the property through legitimate means. Whoever bought the land, whatever their name, whenever they came. Eleanor had not been leaving this to chance. She had been leaving it to intention, to the legal certainty that the right person, whoever they turned out to be, would own what she'd spent 40 years building. But it was the handwritten addendum that stopped the room. Separately notarized, separately signed, attached to the back of the trust document in Eleanor's own hand, the same deliberate handwriting from the blackboard and the instruction sheet, and the margins of 32 years of student files. I am aware that a man named Dennis Hargrove exists, and that his grandfather was the half-brother I never knew. I am aware that Dennis Hargrove may attempt to claim this property or its contents after my death. Dennis Hargrove's father, Robert Hargrove, was my student from 1965 to 1966. He was a quiet boy who sat near the window and had trouble with reading. I worked with him for most of that year. I do not know what became of him. That is the full extent of my relationship with the Hargrove family. I do not owe my blood what I did not choose. The trust stands as written. The courtroom was silent. Dennis looked at the paper Carol placed in front of him, a copy, the original remaining with the judge. He read it again. His expression did not change precisely, but something in it settled the particular settling of a person recognizing something they had already known but had needed to hear said formally before they could stop arguing with it. His lead attorney leaned toward him and said something quietly. Dennis shook his head once. Small. Final. Judge Holt read the trust document through to the end, set it down. Looked at Dennis's table, then at Carol's. The intent of the grantor is unambiguous, she said. The trust is valid, properly executed, and properly filed. The assets at Ridge Road 14 pass to the current owner of record as directed. Motion to contest is denied. She picked up her pen, made a note. The sound of its small administrative ordinary was the sound of the whole thing being over. Dennis stood. He didn't look at his attorneys, didn't gather his papers or button his jacket, or do any of the things that people did when they were managing a loss. He just stood the way people stood when they had run out of next moves and needed a moment before they could decide what came after. He looked at Marge. 1 second. Maybe less. Not with anger. She had braced for anger, had prepared for it, the way you prepared for weather, and it didn't come. What came was something quieter. The look of someone who had driven to eastern Kentucky in an expensive suit with prepared words and mud on his shoes, and had found at the end of it what he had probably known he would find. Then he looked away, picked up his briefcase, walked to the door. Marge watched him go. She watched him push through the courtroom door and move through the corridor beyond and out of sight, a man in a gray suit walking to his car alone in a parking lot in Harlan, Kentucky, a long way from Atlanta, going home to whatever came next. He would never know. He would never know that Eleanor had written about his father. That in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, in an underground facility in the Kentucky hills, there was a folder with the name Robert H., 1965 on the tab, and inside it, in Eleanor's handwriting, a paragraph about a quiet boy who sat near the window and had trouble with reading and whom Eleanor had worked with for most of a year. He would never know what she had written, whether she had found the thing he was certain he could do, whether she had told him he was going to be all right. He would drive back to Atlanta, not knowing that Eleanor had already given the Hargrove family everything she had to give in a classroom in 1965, 32 years before she built the vault, 54 years before she died. And somehow that was the saddest part of the whole day. Not the victory, not the legal language or the notarized document or the judge's pen making its small final sound. Everything Eleanor had seen and kept and never said out loud. Ruth was waiting on the courthouse steps. She didn't ask how it had gone. She had been in the room and knew how it had gone. She handed Marge a coffee in a paper cup, the kind from the diner 2 doors down that was too strong and slightly burnt and exactly right. "Carol did good," Ruth said. "Carol did very good." They stood there for a moment. The November air had the particular quality of Kentucky November, cold enough to feel honest, not cold enough to be cruel. "What happens now?" Ruth asked. Marge held the coffee, thought about Thomas's safe still in her bag, the loan documents folded back into it. Thought about the vault and the children's journals and Eleanor's letter, and the question of what you did with $4.2 million when you were a 58-year-old woman who had spent 31 years finding the right book for the right person at the right moment. "I need to think," she said. "That's allowed," said Ruth. They walked to the car together. The coffee was too strong and slightly burnt. Marge drank it anyway. She sat in the vault alone that night for the first time without a reason, no documents to study, no locks to open, no threats to prepare for. Just the LED lights and Eleanor's journals and 32 years of someone else's quiet attention. She had won. The judge had said so. Carol had said so in her precise, undemonstrative way on the courthouse steps while Ruth handed out bad coffee. The trust was valid. The assets were hers. Dennis Hargrove was driving back to Atlanta, and the thing that had seemed impossible 3 weeks ago was now simply, legally, completely true. She sat in the vault and felt none of it. Not because she was ungrateful, because there was still something unfinished, something that had nothing to do with Dennis or Carol or the Living Trust or $4.2 million. Something that had been sitting at the bottom of her coat pocket since November waiting. She reached in and took out Thomas's loan papers. She had been carrying them since the day she'd opened the safe. Couldn't leave them there. Couldn't bring herself to put them anywhere else. Just carried them the way she had carried his key ring, because some things you didn't put down until you understood what you were putting down. She wasn't looking for new information. She knew what the documents said. She was looking for him. She found him in the dates. She had looked at the loan papers a dozen times in the kitchen, in the car, in the vault, at 2 a.m, when she couldn't sleep, and she had always read them as documents. Amounts, lenders, terms, the shape of the problem. Tonight she read them differently, the way she had learned to read anything that mattered, not for what it said, but for what it showed about the person who had made it. The last loan was signed in March 2020. She turned to the bank statements she'd found clipped to the back of the folder, months of them. She hadn't looked at these before, had assumed they were supplementary supporting material for the loan documents. She went through them page by page. February 2020. A charge she almost missed small between a grocery store and a hardware supplier, Harlan Fine Jewelry. $847. She stopped. She looked at the date. February 14th, 2020. Their 30th wedding anniversary was April 12th, 2020. Thomas had always bought the anniversary gift early. She had teased him about it for years, the way he would present something 2 months ahead of time, with the explanation that he'd seen it and hadn't wanted to wait. She had always said that was the most Thomas thing about him, finding what he wanted to give before the occasion arrived, then being unable to hold it. He had signed a loan extension in March 2020. He had been renegotiating debt in the final year of his life, working through whatever arrangements were possible, with the lenders, trying to keep the pieces together long enough to find a way through. And in February, the month before the last loan, 8 months before he died, he had gone to Harlan Fine Jewelry and spent $847 on a ring she had never received, because he had died in March 2021, and the anniversary had been April, and whatever he had bought and wherever he had put it was somewhere she had never found it and might never find it now. He had been borrowing money while he was drowning to buy her a ring for an anniversary he didn't live to see. She put the papers down very carefully. The way you put down something breakable." Then she cried. Not the way she had expected to cry about Thomas in the months after he died. The sharp, sudden grief that came in the cereal aisle at the grocery store, or in the middle of a sentence she'd started and realized he wasn't there to finish. This was different. This was the crying that came from understanding something completely, from seeing a person clearly for the first time from a direction you hadn't thought to look from knowing that the thing you were seeing was true and permanent, and that you could not go back and say, "I see you now. I understand. It's all right." She cried because he had been afraid, because he had been alone with it for 5 years, the same way Eleanor had been alone in this vault, the same way every person who loved someone and couldn't find the words ended up alone with the thing they couldn't say. And because she hadn't known, and because now she did, and because now she couldn't tell him, she sat on the floor of the vault with Eleanor's journals on the shelves around her, and the LED light cold and even overhead, and cried until she didn't need to anymore. And then she sat quietly for a while. And then she folded the loan papers and put them back in the folder and set the folder on Eleanor's desk and left it there. Not everything needed to be carried. She called Dennis the next morning. Ruth said, "Don't." Carol said, "Absolutely not." Marge listened to both of them and called anyway, not because she was certain it was right, but because Eleanor had written, "Bring it into the light," and she had come to understand that the light wasn't only the vault and the money and the living trust. It was also the things that had been held too long in the wrong hands, including the things that had never been meant to be held at all. They met at the diner on Main Street, the only coffee shop in Harlan, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that had been on the burner since 6 in the morning. Dennis arrived 5 minutes early, which told her something. He was sitting in the back corner with his hands around a coffee cup, and the careful stillness of someone who had prepared again for a confrontation. She sat down across from him and put a small envelope on the table. "Not money," she said. "Not a settlement. Not anything legal." He looked at the envelope, didn't touch it. "It's a photograph," she said. 1983. Your father is in the second row left side. Eleanor is in the back." She watched him open it. Watched him look at it, really look at it, the way people looked at photographs of people they had only known as stories, trying to find the version of the person that matched what they'd been told. "She's not looking at the camera," he said. "She never looked at the camera." He held the photograph for a long moment. The diner moved around them, the waitress refilling someone's coffee, a table of men in work clothes, talking about something Marge couldn't hear, the ordinary mid-morning of a small town that had no idea what was happening in this particular corner booth. "He talked about her every year," Dennis said. "Not to her. The same way he'd spoken at the doorway of the vault, looking at the blackboard. First day of school every year. He'd say there was a teacher who told me I was going to be all right. When I was 10, I thought that was just something teachers said." A pause. "When I was 40, I understood it differently." Marge said nothing. "I don't know what he would have done with the money," Dennis said. "Probably something reasonable. Probably something I would have approved of." He set the photograph down carefully, facing up. "I know what I was going to do with it. And I know it wasn't that." He looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for this." She walked back to her car in the November cold. It was still November in her mind, would probably always be November in the part of her that had stood in that yard with foreclosure papers and a dead man's keys and sat for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about Eleanor writing, "Bring it into the light," in a journal no one was supposed to read, and about Thomas buying a ring in February for an anniversary he didn't live to see, and about a quiet boy who sat near the window and had trouble with reading, and about how the things people kept hidden were almost never the things they thought they were hiding. They were almost always love. Badly expressed, poorly timed, sealed behind the wrong kind of door, but love. That was the part she understood now. The library opened on a Thursday in April, 8 months after a $400 bid on a government auction website. 6 months after a courtroom in Harlan County. 4 months after a diner booth and a photograph of a class from 1983. The building was the old Harlan Public Library, bought back, expanded on the east side, the children's section 3 times the size it had been. The reading rug, new, and the beanbag chairs, new, and the shelves full of books that Marge had chosen herself over 4 months of careful, deliberate selection. The fiction section leaned heavily toward the authors the women of Harlan County had always wanted to read. She had never seen the point of stocking a library with books nobody wanted. Above the front door, a brass plaque, new, polished, catching the April light. Eleanor Voss and Thomas Calloway Memorial Library, for everyone who kept something quiet too long. Ruth stood beside her on the steps. "Thomas would have liked this," Ruth said. "I know." Marge looked at the plaque. "That's why I did it." Inside, Deputy Sal at the entrance, looking more serious than the occasion strictly required, because Sal didn't know how to attend something he cared about without looking like he was guarding it. A group of children from the elementary school arriving with their teacher, settling onto the reading rug with the absorbed quiet of children who had found something worth being quiet for. Marge stood in the middle of the main room and looked around. On the wall to the left, Eleanor's class photograph from 1983. 22 children, 3 rows, and Eleanor at the side, not looking at the camera, looking at the child in the front row, who stood slightly apart, the only one not smiling. The focused, patient attention of someone who had decided this particular person was worth understanding. Beside it, a photograph of Thomas. 1990. Standing on a small bridge somewhere in eastern Kentucky, smiling at whoever was holding the camera, in the uncomplicated way of someone who didn't know they were being photographed and had nothing to perform. A civil engineer doing his job on an ordinary day, in a year that was ordinary in every way except that Marge had been 25 and in love with him, and had taken the photograph herself. 2 people who never met. Both of them in their own way had spent their lives building things meant to hold bridges, vaults, marriages, classrooms, and both of them had learned too late or not late enough that the things worth building weren't the structures. They were what you let through. Their names on the same door. Open. Marge reached into her coat pocket. The key ring was there. It was always there, had been there since November, the weight of it as familiar as her own hand. She found the smallest key without looking. The safe key. The one she had never used until the day she had to. The one that had opened the thing Thomas had been keeping and shown her finally what he had been keeping it from. She walked to the front desk. She set the key down beside the patron register, the first one lying open, the first page blank, waiting for the first name. Not the whole ring. Just the one key, the smallest one, placed quietly on the wooden surface of a desk in a library that hadn't existed 8 months ago and now held 32 years of Eleanor Voss's attention and everything Thomas Calloway had been trying to say. Not everything needs to be kept. She sat down in the chair behind the desk, reached to the shelf beside her, and took down the book she had chosen for this Eleanor Voss's journal typeset, and bound the first book cataloged and shelved in the new collection call number in the upper left corner library card pocket, inside the back cover, ready to be checked out by anyone who wanted to read it. She opened it to the first page. September 9th, 1971. The first day. 22 children who did not know me and had no reason to trust me. She began to read. Slowly. Carefully. paying attention to the things that people kept quiet too long.